The wind whipped dead leaves through the streets, rattling like bones as they skittered across the cracked pavement. Another Halloween night in our small, forgotten town where the chill in the air felt like more than just autumn. It felt alive. You could almost taste the unease on your tongue. It was always like this on Halloween. Every year, a party at the old warehouse. Every year, someone new showed up. And every year, something seemed to shift just a little further into the wrong direction. This year was no different, except for the stranger in the mask. I didn't see him arrive. No one did, really. He was just there. Standing at the edge of the crowd, his body cloaked in shadows. His mask an old, cracked porcelain with a faint, faded grin that barely held together by thin, fraying straps. He didn't move. He didn't speak. Just watched, as if he were cataloging us. Measuring. At first, no one cared. It was Halloween, after all. People wore masks. But there was something about this one. Something that gnawed at the back of your mind and told you not to look too closely. A voice inside that whispered, "Danger," though no one wanted to say it out loud. My friends didn't notice him, not like I did. Maybe they were too drunk, too high, or too wrapped up in their own drama to care. But I couldn't shake it. Every time I turned around, I felt him watching me. Those hollow eyes behind the mask tracking my every move. "I think someone's following us," I said to my buddy, eyes flicking over my shoulder for the 100th time. We were outside now, taking a break from the suffocating heat of the warehouse. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on us, even with the cold biting at our skin. "Who?" he asked, barely listening as he scrolled through his phone. "The guy in the mask. He's been staring at us all night." He laughed, the sound too loud, too sharp in the quiet. "Relax, man. It's Halloween. People dress weird." But it wasn't just that. There was something wrong about the way he moved, or didn't move. It was as if he blended into the shadows, like a part of them, shifting from one dark corner to another without making a sound. And yet, whenever I turned, there he was. Always just close enough to be seen, but never close enough to confront. That's when the first scream tore through the night. We ran back into the warehouse, shoving our way through the crowd. People were already scattering, their faces twisted in panic. I caught a glimpse of someone crumpled on the floor, a red smear soaking through their costume, spreading like a grotesque flower blooming in the center of the room. A girl, lifeless, her throat cut so deeply it was almost severed. Panic erupted. People shoved past us, tripping over each other in their desperate attempt to escape. I felt a sick twist in my stomach as my friend and I backed into a corner, away from the chaos, trying to make sense of what just happened. That's when I saw him again. The masked stranger. He was standing at the edge of the room, his head slightly cocked, as if he were admiring his handiwork. The mask's faint smile seemed wider now, more sinister in the dim light, the shadows stretching across his face like spider legs. Before I could react, he moved, slipping into the crowd with an eerie, unnatural fluidity. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, vanished into the sea of terrified faces. "Did you see that?" I gasped, grabbing my friend's arm. But he shook me off, too panicked to focus. "We need to get out of here, man!" he yelled, his eyes wide with fear. We pushed our way through the exit, the cold air slamming into us like a wall. I was trembling, but not from the chill. My mind raced. Who was that? And more importantly, what was that? "I saw him," I whispered as we sprinted down the alley behind the warehouse. "The guy in the mask. He was there, just standing there, watching." My friend shot me a terrified glance, but said nothing. We kept running, the warehouse fading behind us, but the fear didn't leave. It clung to me like a second skin, heavy and suffocating. We didn't stop running until we reached my house, the door slamming shut behind us. The world outside suddenly felt far too quiet, far too still. My hands shook as I locked every door, pulled every curtain closed. But no matter how safe I tried to make it, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "Do you think he followed us?" my friend whispered, barely able to get the words out. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice hollow. But deep down, I knew the truth. He was out there, somewhere, and the night wasn't over yet. That's when the pounding started. Not at the front door, not at the back. The pounding came from the basement. The pounding echoed through the house, each thud rattling the walls and freezing the air around us. We stared at each other, eyes wide, both knowing what the other was thinking but too scared to say it. It didn't make sense. We hadn't been in the basement all night. I barely used it except for storage, and yet the sound came from down there, a heavy, deliberate thudding, like someone or something was trying to get out. My throat tightened, my heart pounding harder than the noise itself. "What the hell is that?" My friend's voice was barely a whisper, his face pale in the dim light of the living room. I don't know," I stammered, swallowing the lump that had formed in my throat. Another thud, louder this time. Closer. We stood frozen, listening, the silence between each pound somehow worse than the noise itself. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for what came next. Then, with a final crash, the pounding stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. "I'm calling the cops," my friend said, pulling out his phone with trembling hands. But before he could dial, the lights flickered, sputtered, and died. Darkness swallowed the room. My pulse raced as I fumbled for my phone, my fingers slick with sweat. The screen's faint glow was the only thing keeping the fear from choking me whole. But it wasn't enough. The dark seemed to press in, suffocating, as if it were alive, as if it were watching. And then faintly we heard it. A creak. Slow, deliberate. The basement door opening. The air was too thick to breathe. I stood rooted to the spot, unable to move as the door creaked wider, its hinges groaning in the stillness. I could feel my friend beside me, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Neither of us said a word. We didn't need to. We both knew what was coming. From the darkness at the foot of the stairs, something moved. At first it was just a shadow slipping along the floor, blending into the blackness. But then I saw it, the faint pale gleam of a mask. The cracked porcelain surface catching the faintest glimmer of light from my phone. It was him, the masked stranger. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, motionless, his head tilted ever so slightly, as though he were listening, waiting. The mask's grin seemed wider now, more menacing, like it was mocking us. I could see his breath, slow, steady, deliberate, pluming from beneath the mask. He wasn't in any rush. He knew we weren't going anywhere. My heart slammed against my ribs, panic clawing at the edges of my mind. My friend grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the front door, but it felt like we were moving in slow motion, every step heavy with dread. "We need to get out of here," he hissed, his voice hoarse with fear. But the door wouldn't budge. I yanked on the handle, pulling with all my strength, but it was like the door had been welded shut. No matter how hard I pulled, it didn't move. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing colder, thicker. Then I heard it again, that slow, deliberate creak. He was coming up the stairs. "Run," I breathed, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. We bolted toward the kitchen, the only place left to go. My friend grabbed a knife from the counter, his hands shaking so badly I wasn't sure he'd even be able to use it. I fumbled for my phone again, the screen barely illuminating the space around us. But I didn't need light to know what was happening. The basement door swung fully open with a slow, eerie groan. He was in the house now, moving through the darkness with that same unnatural fluidity. Silent, patient. The knife in my friend's hand looked useless, like a toy against something as cold and deliberate as him. I could hear him breathing now, low and measured. Closer, closer. "We need to get out," my friend whispered, his voice cracking. But I couldn't move. I couldn't think. My body was locked in place, every nerve on fire with fear. My phone's faint light flickered as the masked stranger stepped into the doorway, his mask glowing faintly in the dark, that cracked, sinister smile aimed right at me. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. He was right there, standing still, watching, waiting. My friend lunged forward with the knife, desperate, swinging wildly. For a moment, the blade caught the faint glow of my phone light, slicing through the air. But it hit nothing. The masked stranger moved, impossibly fast, like a shadow dissolving and reappearing at will. And then the knife clattered to the floor. I turned, expecting to see my friend still standing behind me. But all that was left was the sound of the blade hitting the ground and the thud of a body collapsing against the kitchen floor. He was gone. The stranger stepped forward, his mask tilted, as if considering me. It was then that I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Beneath the cracks in the porcelain, something glistened, a dark, wet sheen seeping through the mask. Blood. My friend's blood. And as the masked stranger's head cocked to the side, I felt the cold grip of terror tighten around my throat. We weren't just being watched. We were being hunted. A creak echoed behind me, but before I could turn, I felt something cold against my skin. The darkness wasn't just watching. It was here, and it was closing in. The cold pressed against my skin, like death itself had reached out and brushed my cheek. My body froze, every instinct screaming at me to run. but my legs felt like lead anchored to the spot. The darkness around me thickened, suffocating, and in it, I could hear that steady, deliberate breathing. The masked stranger was there, inches from me, though I couldn't see him anymore. I wanted to scream, to yell for help, but the words caught in my throat, swallowed by the oppressive quiet that filled the house. My friend was gone, vanished into the void as if he had never been there at all. The only thing left was the kitchen knife, still spinning on the floor from where he dropped it, the metal scraping a haunting rhythm against the tile. I took a step backward, my heart thudding so loud in my chest I was sure the stranger could hear it. I felt the floorboards creak under my feet as I moved, slow, careful. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something metallic, coppery, blood. I edged toward the hallway, eyes darting toward every shadow, every corner, trying to keep track of where he was. But the masked stranger was a phantom, slipping in and out of sight, always just on the edge of my vision. And worse, there was no sound. No footsteps, no rustling of clothes. Just the silence. It was then I saw it. The faintest outline of his mask reflected in the window at the far end of the hall. He was behind me. I bolted. My feet hit the floor hard as I ran down the hallway blindly, the adrenaline making every second stretch out like hours. Behind me, I could feel the air shift, the cold creeping up my spine, but I didn't dare look back. I burst into the living room, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps, eyes darting to the front door. Still locked, still sealed shut. There was nowhere to go. But then I heard something, a faint rhythmic tapping. Not from behind me this time. No, this was coming from upstairs. Tap, tap, tap. I glanced toward the staircase. The shadows were thick at the top, but I could see movement, a slow, deliberate shifting like someone or something was waiting, watching. The tapping grew louder. My breath caught in my throat. The masked stranger couldn't be in two places at once, could he? I spun around, but the reflection in the hallway window was gone. No time to think, no time to question. I ran. Up the stairs, taking them two at a time, my heart slamming against my ribs with each step. The air grew colder the higher I climbed, until I could see my breath puffing out in small, frightened bursts. When I reached the top, the tapping stopped. I stood there, trembling, trying to catch my breath, listening to the silence. It was too quiet. The kind of quiet that pressed in from all sides, like the house itself was holding its breath. Every nerve in my body screamed that I had made a mistake, that I should have never come up here. But there was no turning back now. The hallway stretched out before me, the doors to the bedrooms cracked open just enough to reveal slivers of shadow. And there, at the end of the hall, something moved. A shape, a figure. Not the masked stranger this time, but something else. The silhouette of a woman. She stood with her back to me, facing the far window, her body swaying slightly, as though caught in a trance. Her hair was long, matted, tangled like she'd been in the woods for years, forgotten. Her arms hung limp at her sides, her fingers twitching in slow, jerky movements. Who are you? I managed to croak, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer, didn't move, just kept swaying back and forth, back and forth. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my ears. Something about her seemed familiar, but that didn't make sense. I didn't know her. I would have remembered someone like this, someone so wrong. Another step, and another. That's when she turned. Her face wasn't a face. It was porcelain, cracked, just like the masked stranger's mask. But this wasn't just a mask. It was her. The skin beneath was gone, replaced with pale, brittle ceramic, the same eerie, hollow grin carved into the surface. My stomach lurched. She raised her hand, slow and deliberate, pointing past me, down the hallway where I had come from. I didn't want to look. I knew what I would see, but I couldn't stop myself. My head turned, and there, standing at the top of the stairs, was him, the masked stranger. Except there were more of them now. 2, 3, 4 masked figures, all identical, all with that same porcelain grin, standing in the shadows, watching. Their heads tilted in unison, the cracking sound of their masks shifting, echoing in the stillness. I stumbled back, the cold sweat pouring down my neck as my brain scrambled to understand. What were they? How did they get here? "Why are you doing this?" I screamed, my voice shaking, desperate for an answer. But they said nothing, just stood there, waiting. I was trapped, nowhere left to run. The figures began to move forward, slow and deliberate, their footsteps echoing through the empty house. I backed away, my legs shaking, feeling the cold grip of terror wrapping tighter and tighter around my throat. And then I realized the reflection in the window downstairs, the figure at the top of the stairs, the woman in the hallway. They were all the same. They were all me. The masks, the porcelain faces, they were all twisted reflections of myself. And as I stared into their hollow, empty eyes, I understood the terrible truth. The masked stranger had never been someone else. It had been me. A hand gripped my shoulder, cold, tight. And the last thing I saw before the darkness took me was my own reflection, staring back at me through the cracked porcelain mask. Part 4. The Masked Stranger. The cold grip on my shoulder tightened, pulling me back into the suffocating darkness. For a moment I thought this was it, this was the end. But something stirred inside me, a flicker of defiance, of hope. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Not for me, not now. I clenched my fists, and with every ounce of strength I had left, I broke free from the icy hold that had me trapped. I stumbled forward, gasping for air, the darkness retreating for just a moment. My legs were weak, but I forced myself to stand, to move. I turned, half expecting to see the masked strangers closing in, their porcelain grins looming out of the shadows. But the hallway was empty. No figures, no masks, no sound. Just the eerie silence of the house, as if everything had simply disappeared. Had it been a hallucination? A trick of the mind? No, I knew what I had seen. I could still feel the weight of their eyes, their presence lingering just beyond the edge of perception. But something had changed. The cold, oppressive fear that had been suffocating me moments ago was lifting, like fog burning away in the morning light. I slowly made my way down the stairs, my heart still racing but the terror ebbing, replaced by a strange calm. As I descended, the house felt different, lighter, almost peaceful. The air was no longer thick and stifling, and the shadows no longer felt alive. I reached the bottom of the stairs, my hands still trembling as I clung to the banister. The front door, the same one that had been sealed shut, stood ajar. Light from the outside world spilled into the entryway, warm and inviting. For a moment I hesitated, unsure if this was another trick, another game the house was playing. But the light was real. I could feel its warmth on my skin, drawing me forward. My feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the door. Each step felt like shedding a layer of fear, of darkness. By the time I reached the threshold, I was no longer trembling. I stepped outside. The cold night air hit me, crisp and refreshing, but there was something else in the air, a sense of relief, of freedom. I took a deep breath, letting it fill my lungs, and for the first time in hours, I felt alive. The town was quiet, the streets empty, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. No masked figures, no lurking shadows, just the stillness of the night. I stood there, taking it all in, my mind still reeling from everything that had happened. It didn't make sense. How had I escaped? Why had the darkness let me go? The questions swirled in my head, but deep down, I knew there was only one answer. I had chosen to face it. The house hadn't been haunted by some malevolent force. The masked stranger hadn't been a monster stalking me. It had been my fear, my own darkness, manifesting itself, feeding off my terror, growing stronger the more I tried to run from it. The masks, the reflections, they had been pieces of me, fragments of the fear I had refused to confront. And when I had finally stopped running, when I had stood my ground and faced the darkness head-on, it had lost its power. I walked away from the house, the last remnants of fear falling away with each step. The memories of the night still lingered, but they no longer held the same weight. They were just that, memories, shadows of a time that had passed. As I reached the end of the street, I heard a voice, faint, distant but unmistakable. "Hey!" I turned, squinting into the darkness. A figure emerged from the shadows, familiar and welcome. It was my friend. He was alive. "I thought I lost you," he said, his voice shaking with relief as he ran toward me. "I know," I said, cutting him off, my own relief overwhelming me. "But it's over. It's all over." We stood there for a moment, catching our breath, the weight of the night slowly melting away. The fear, the darkness, it was gone. "I don't know what happened back there," my friend said, his voice quieter now. "But I feel like we made it out of something we were never meant to escape." I nodded, feeling the truth of his words. "Maybe we did, but we're here now. We're okay." The town around us was quiet, peaceful, as if nothing had ever happened. The masked stranger was gone, and the night felt lighter, free of the oppressive weight that had clung to it before. We walked toward the rising dawn, the first light of morning breaking over the horizon. The warmth of the sun touched my skin, and I smiled, a real, genuine smile. Whatever haunted the town, whatever darkness had been lurking in that house, it was gone now. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt free. We survived.